Bonjour, Monsieur le Ministre.
Good evening, Minister. Thank you very much for having us, France 24, RFI, the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Next to me, Christophe Boisbouvier in Radio France International. In Ukraine, Russians announced yesterday that they would drastically reduce their military activity around Kiev and Chernihiv. But at the same time, as we have the negotiations in Turkey that are underway and seem to be making progress, a few months ago, you said the worst is still to come. Now, are you more optimistic than you were today, and do you see a silver lining?
No. No, insofar that for the time being war goes on. I read statements, I read declarations, I see no actions. There's, to the best of my knowledge, no measure of withdrawal taken regarding the occupation by the Russian forces in the Ukraine. War goes on in Kiev. It was bombed this night in Dnipro, in Kharkiv, in Mariupol. It's becoming a martyr city. The siege of Mariupol, decided by President Putin, leads to 200,000 people taken on hostage. War goes on. And for the time being, to the best of my knowledge, there is no breakthrough, nothing new. You're referring to statements. Many statements were made on behalf of the Russian authorities, very variable ways, but
you don't believe in that?
I believe in actions. If tomorrow morning President Putin says, as a sign of my will to reorganize, I renounce to the siege of Mariupol, and I enable humanitarian aid to get into Mariupol, and I enable the population, civilian population, to circulate freely, then I will say, oh, yes, there is a progress. And I'll say, yes, maybe the worst is not ahead of us. But today, I have no actions.
You said, like Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, there's what Russia says and what Russia does. So you don't really trust Vladimir Putin.
Trust is actions. There has always been actions. And for the time being, they're not there.
Is it foolish to believe in ceasefire?
There must be a ceasefire, but the ceasefire is not... I mean, it has to be a political decision of President Putin to say, okay, we stop and we negotiate. For the time being, it's not the case. You talk about negotiation. It's true that there was an event around the negotiations in Istanbul, but the discussion started 3 weeks ago. They were occurring in Belarus, in Gomel, and in Antalya partly, on the same topics, with less, show, but no breakthrough. So this is the reality. So let's not be illusioned by these statements. We need actions. If Russia wishes really to be trusted, it should put actions on the table, concretely, to show this new orientation, if there is one.
But aren't the Russians going to release the vice around Kiev, maybe to redeploy their forces in the east of Ukraine, in the Donbass region? So removing soldiers from the north to place them in the east?
We shall see. For the time being, it's just announcement. Kiev was bombed this night.
Aren't you fearing concentration of Russian troops in the Donbass?
It is possible that given the problems of the Russian army in Ukraine, plans be reassessed, but this time where we are waiting for more in-depth discussion be used by Russia to rebuild its forces. You know, the strategy of a war of siege, which is implemented currently by Russia, siege of Kharkiv, siege of Mariupol.
That's what you predicted.
Yes, I said the war of siege are terrible. We have a long history of the war of siege. It's Grozny and Aleppo, where we have seen, I think of Aleppo because I was then in charge, we've seen Russia say, we're going to negotiate. And then, in fact, the reality was to rebuild its strength. So we shall see. We shall see if the statements will be translated in concrete actions. And hence, either in a withdrawal or an announcement of a ceasefire. That should be today. What is needed today is an announcement of a ceasefire in Mariupol to avoid the bloodshed. What's happening in Mariupol is terrible. The responsibility of what is going to happen in Mariupol is the full responsibility of Russia.
We were talking about negotiations and talking about the military aspect and the diplomatic aspect. So for the first time, as you said, in 3 weeks, negotiations have made progress. Ukrainians would waive their objective to join NATO and would accept a status of neutrality, but only if large countries such as France guarantee their security. Now, concretely, what does this mean, Minister? Because it looks very much like Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which says that an attack against one of the allies is an attack against all.
You said the negotiation progressed. They didn't.
No, but in terms of communication, it looks very much like it.
It's the same topics that have been raised regularly by the Russian and Ukrainian delegation for the past 3 weeks, with a big progress set by President Zelensky, saying, I agree to work on the concept of neutrality of the Ukraine. But I said at the same time, beyond neutrality, we have to define the content. For the time being, it's not the case. We need guarantees of security. That's absolutely normal. So let's think about the security guarantees. For the time being, there's no acceptation, neither of the first nor of the second principle.
Yes, but maybe we should think about what it means to guarantee another country's security.
We agree to work with President Zelensky to see how to ensure guarantees. But the problem, there must be a true negotiation, and it would be opportune right now for President Zelensky to meet with President Putin. Just that. For the time being, it's impossible, because President Putin says no.
Now, a security guarantee now, President Zelensky would not request those for Crimea and Donbass. Does this mean that in the future those two regions might be attached to Russia? And could this be a solution?
I shall not negotiate in lieu of the Ukrainians. It's up to the Ukrainians to negotiate with Russia. We know the issues of the negotiation: neutrality, guarantees, level of demilitarization of Ukraine, territories, which status on Donbass, and the issue of Crimea. Moreover, the need of a ceasefire when, and the need also for an agenda of progressive withdrawal of the Russian forces. This is the bundle of negotiation. It's been, 3 weeks that it's that. And besides President Zelensky, the only strong initiative is the one that he announced his will to do so that Ukraine becomes a neutral country.
Isn't it a bit foolish to speak of neutrality when one has Russia as a neighbor?
Hence the need for guarantees. Hence the need for negotiations. And you do not negotiate with a gun at point blank. Hence the need for a ceasefire. Moreover, you see that if there is a modification of the constitution of the Ukraine, because to say neutrality, you need a referendum. Can you hold the referendum in Ukraine while the Russian forces are present on the territory? No. So you need to negotiate. All this for the time being didn't start. We wish it to move forward. Hence the need for a ceasefire. It's going to be long, but we start to see what could be the parameters. The Ukrainian president has some ideas on that. We have to discuss with President Putin. Hence the need also to do so that there is permanently a link to be maintained with President Putin. This is why President Macron,
he kept the connection.
Talks to him often on the phone to maintain a channel of dialogue and to do so that at the right time we could talk in depth. I hope this time will come soon and that we shall avoid the bloodshed of Mariupol.
Now, what's President Macron running up against when he speaks to President Putin over the phone?
The positions are generally stated clearly, generally with a lot of clarity on both sides. They talk again. It moves a little, but at least there is a channel of discussion which is potential. And the President Macron talks also with President Putin, sometimes together with the German Chancellor. So President Putin should be aware that he has, in this discussion, two partners who are ready to encourage the dialogue, but who are also very firm on the sovereignty of Ukraine, and who refuse the fact that the state is aggressing another state, like it's happening now, with all the pains, all the suffering it imposes to the Ukrainian people.
So you're saying, well now, maybe this might be a piece of good news. The Turks are now in this terrible chaos. The Turks are at the center of mediation now. And Presidents Macron and Erdogan spoke to each other recently. Is this falling out between France and Turkey something of the past now?
When it's about saving lives, to enable peace, to stop the process, the dramatic process we're facing, you don't stop on trivialities. You try to move things forward, and all the goodwill are welcome.
The Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said that if the Russians were to use chemical weapons, which is still possible, this would have massive consequences. Do you confirm this? Is this something you fear?
Should Russia use non-conventional weapon of that kind, they should expect massive sanctions, very strong sanctions. They know, we told them already. So they have to take this into account, those risks.
We saw in 2013, when chemical weapons were used in Syria, everybody, including the USA, turned a blind eye to it. Aren't you fearing the same thing might happen?
I think President Putin is aware of something. The unity and the firmness, and of the European Union, of all of the countries, and of the transatlantic relation, the solidity of the alliance, and also the will of all those countries to help firmly Ukraine, at the same time through sanctions and a financial support, but also through the delivery of military equipment. He knows that, so it's up to him to assess the risks. And it's his responsibility.
In terms of military equipment, also provided by France.
Yes, military equipment, defensive, but lethal to Ukraine. We and all the European countries.
Lethal equipment?
Yes.
And what if chemical weapons were to be used? Do we have to heighten the sanctions, as Boris Johnson said?
I won't give you an answer.
But yes.
I said heavy and massive sanctions. I won't describe them.
Talking about the disaster in Mariupol, it was impossible to convince Vladimir Putin of creating a humanitarian corridor. Even on that point, he won't give in.
The concept of humanitarian corridor, the Russian way, is a special concept integrated in the rationale of the war of sieges. We had the experience in Grozny, in Aleppo. We are concerned by this experience in Mariupol. I leave you a humanitarian corridor, but you will come to Russia. And those who are not leaving, you're regarded as either terrorists or Nazis. The word has been used. It's a pretext of strengthening the bombings. This is the rationale of the humanitarian corridor, the Russian way. What we want on Mariupol is a ceasefire, a lifting of the siege, and an easy transport of humanitarian support to the population of Mariupol. And we shouldn't be misled by statements of Russia, while the reality is the tragedy of Mariupol currently.
And would it be possible to imagine that Emmanuel Macron will go to either Kiev or Moscow?
We have proven already with a lot of force that initiatives of peace are taken when need be, with the risks that should be taken. He showed it by going to Moscow, but currently the question is no longer relevant.
Since the beginning of the war, the European Union has been standing united, but Germany depends a lot more on Russian gas than France does. Isn't this fantastic unity going to crumble when talking about sanctions and the embargo?
The big news is that Europe of today is not the same as it was before February 24th. There was an exceptional European Council in Versailles that approved the agenda of Versailles, where Europeans decided together to acquire the energy autonomy as soon as possible, with stages, so also the strengthening of the energy transition adapted to the climate change, not to depend anymore on the fossil energy from Russia. This movement will be implemented as of this year. It will go on to have sustainable answers and concerns all the countries, including Germany.
So we need to look for new partners. And that goes back to the first part of my question. You just returned from Doha in Qatar, and you announced that we were very close to reaching an agreement on the Iranian nuclear program. When you say close to that, does that mean a number of days, weeks, or months? What is the stumbling block between Tehran and Washington?
The big breakthrough regarding the Iranian nuclear things is that we're almost on the verge of an agreement regarding the agreements of Vienna, what we call in technical terms the GCPO, namely Iran is ready to renounce to the accession to nuclear armament, and that the sanctions that were linked to this rush forward of Iran towards the nuclear armament will be lifted. We agree on the content. We means the Europeans, Iran, Russia, China, and the United States, who are not stakeholders anymore, but who gave their agreement. The signing is imminent, and it would be a very good thing that we shouldn't add a crisis of the nuclear proliferation to the existing war in Ukraine. There is a blocking point, not linked to this agreement, which is independent, which is linked to the relation between the United States and Iran. On other issues, on one other issue especially, I hope we'll be able to settle this issue, because then we will sign immediately.
Is there any risk of famine developing in some countries of the southern hemisphere with the real chaos on the grain market? And what can France do? Are there any supplies of grain, and what can France do to prevent famine?
There is a real risk of food shortage in grain, maize, sunflower, because Ukraine is a great producer. It's difficult to cultivate things in Ukraine. The risk is also due to the fact that the logistic transports are very difficult for Ukraine, but also for Russia. And we shouldn't be misled by speeches developed by the Russians, according to which, if there is in the future a risk of famine, it's due to the sanctions. It's not due to the sanctions, it's due to the occupation by the Russians of Ukraine. You do not cultivate large lands in the presence of military forces. It's impossible. Hence, major concerns regarding the food security in some countries. I think about the Middle East, Africa especially, and hence the initiative taken by President of the Republic during the meeting of the G7 in Brussels last week. It's the Operation Farm, namely take initiatives in 3 different areas. First, in the area of the trade, more transparency, more fluidity on the markets, storage, avoid speculation on grain, a system of solidarity to do so that the countries which are at pain be supported by deliveries.
But we have to stock the supplies.
And that would enable the World Food Programme to do its work and not be submitted by speculation and storage, to be able to redistribute and to produce more. And all the countries are incited to do so. This triptych is major. It is initiated by France, but taken up by the European Union so that we can be in solidarity and avoid those risks, which are not for the near future, but for the medium term.
Now, Minister, talking about Mali, the Barkhane force is backing up after 9 years of presence on the ground. 58 soldiers lost their lives. Jihadists are still there, and they even extended their control over the territory. Now, don't you have a feeling of this being a huge mess from several Mariupol to Barkhane and a feeling of helplessness?
The mess is political because we remind often the initiative of Serval then and Barkhane to avoid the terrorist actions of groups which are organized. You have to remind the viewers and the listeners, the terrorist groups, it's at the same time ISIS and Al-Qaeda. It's not informal groups. They have organizations who are used to this kind of battle they are leading, and we did well to act then to protect Mali. We did well because the challenge was the sovereignty and the integrity. It was, and it is still, the sovereignty and integrity of Mali. And the date I'm referring the most is 2015, the agreements of Algiers. That's a base. That's a solution. There were negotiations, there were discussions leading to those agreements that the people in charge in Mali, for many reasons, didn't want to implement. Those Algiers agreement, it's based on decentralization, on disarmament of the armed group signatories, by including them in the army or in the police, and the decentralization, disarmament, and development, the 3 Ds. And the beginning of the beginning was almost invisible. There is this text which is guaranteed by the Algerian authorities, who are guarantors of this agreement. We're talking about guarantees. Well, the Algerian authorities have the responsibility to implement those agreements, but for the time being, there's no answer from the Mali side. And the Algiers agreement enabled the presence of the United Nations forces on the Mali territory to implement them. The agreement is there on the table. Let's use it.
For 2 months now, the military in Mali and the Wagner men have been made accountable by the UN and by Human Rights Watch of serious crimes in Mali. Do you confirm this information?
All the elements we have, including from the NGOs who investigated on the topic, including the United Nations, show that at the end of the day, the presence of Wagner in Mali, what is it? It's atrocities and the limitation of the public liberties. You know about that.
You're referring to the suspension of our broadcasting by Mali.
It's the new authoritarianism, making that the junta at the helm is taken hostage on those points by the Wagner force. Wagner, who was a force of liberation, is a force of atrocities and exactions. And they are pilfering Mali. This is what it's very serious.
There's little time indeed. A couple of months ago, the French ambassador in Bamako was expelled by the Malian authorities, charging him with plotting against them. His own form of dialogue interrupted. Is Emmanuel Macron talking to the head of the military junta, Colonel Assimi Goïta?
This government has no legitimacy at all. It's a government that came out of a coup, and it's a government that doesn't implement the ways of legitimate recognition they could have from the people in Mali, with the ECOWAS, which is organizing all of the states of the region to fight against terrorism. Because what's going to happen, it's a re-articulation of the French system and of the European system there. And the decision to reposition, to reorganize, has been taken by the Europeans and by the Africans together last February. In order to organize differently, it's really a redesign and to give a wider amplitude of our support to the various countries impacted by the terrorist threat, and also the countries of the Gulf of Guinea, because we see a breakthrough, a porosity of the terrorist actions in the north of the country.
France is going to redeploy its forces in Niger. We saw there was a very violent demonstration, anti-French demonstration in Terra in November last, when a military convoy of Barkhane was passing by with 3 casualties among the demonstrators. Aren't we going to have the same problem in Niger? An anti-French sentiment?
That's absolutely not the way it's going to happen. France will not redeploy itself in Niger. What I just said is that we will reorganize together. When I say we, it's the Europeans and the Africans. In order to do so, that the 4 pillars of what we call the Agreement of N'Djamena, i.e. the fight against terrorism, the training of the military forces of the concerned countries, the return of the government in the reconquered areas, and the development. I go to Madrid next Monday in order to be part of the 3rd meeting of the Alliance for Sahel to mobilize funds for those countries. We shall reorganize given the needs and the requests of each and every concerned state, either in Sahel or in the Gulf of Guinea, with answers variable according to the various countries, and in solidarity, Europeans and Africans. It's not France is reinstalling itself in Niger, no. In Niger, there's going to be a request, okay.
Yes, there will be a French military presence.
No, European. European. I'll say it 3 times, European.
Thank you, Minister, for granting us this interview. And thank you all for following us on France 24 and Radio France International.